This story begins as a school story. A new boy walks into a classroom in Scotland. He is polite, quiet, focused. He is not the loudest boy in the room. He is not the class clown. He does not arrive with drama around him, not at first. He arrives with a story. He says he has come from Canada. He says life has already handed him more loss than most teenagers should have to carry. He has a slightly strange accent, a mature way of speaking, a face that looks older than the other students, and the kind of seriousness that adults often mistake for trauma. And in a school full of ambitious families, exam pressure, teenage insecurity, and teachers trying to keep everything moving, he becomes something very useful: the model pupil. The boy who studies, the boy who helps, the boy who wants to be a doctor, the boy who seems like proof that a damaged life can still be repaired if someone just works hard enough. That is what this story looks like from a distance: an underdog, a second chance, a boy rebuilding himself after tragedy. But false fiction does not open files because the distance looks ordinary. We open them because, somewhere inside the ordinary, one detail refuses to behave. And in this file, the detail was simple. The new boy was not new, and he was not a boy. This is false fiction, unscripted truth with no rules. Real stories that sound invented until the truth is entered into evidence. Tonight's story begins as an inspirational school comeback. That is the first lie. Bear's Den sits just outside Glasgow in Scotland. It is the kind of place people describe with words like leafy, comfortable, and respectable. A place where families move because they want a better future for their children. A place where a school is not just a school, it is a social signal. Bearsden Academy was the sort of school where achievement mattered, exams mattered, university mattered, becoming something mattered. For teenagers inside that world, the pressure was normal because everyone around them was breathing the same air. Do well, get the grades, get out, become impressive. Then, in 1993, a new pupil arrived. His name, he said, was Brandon Lee. Not the actor, not the son of Bruce Lee, just a boy who happened to have that name at exactly the moment when that name was already famous and tragic in the wider world. He was said to be a teenager from Canada. He enrolled at Bearsden Academy as a senior pupil. He was there to sit his hires, the exams that could open the door to university. He had a backstory. He had lived overseas. He had come to Scotland. There were stories of family tragedy. There was a grandmother. There were reasons, or what sounded like reasons, for why he seemed a little different. And that is the dangerous power of a believable lie. It does not have to explain everything. It only has to explain enough. Lie 1. His name was Brandon Lee. At the start, nobody needed more than that. Schools run on forms, timetables, bells, assumptions. A teacher sees a child because the system has already labelled him as one. A classroom accepts a pupil because the office has accepted him first. And teenagers are not forensic examiners. They are teenagers. They notice things, but they do not always know what those things mean. They noticed his voice. They noticed his face. They noticed that he carried himself differently. Some reportedly nicknamed him things that hinted at what they could see but not prove. In later accounts, classmates remembered that people joked about him looking older. But a joke is not an investigation. Teenagers joke about everything. A boy can look old for his age. A boy can sound old for his age. A boy can be strange, intense, awkward, damaged, overly mature, brilliant, lonely. There are 100 normal explanations for one abnormal truth. So Brandon Lee became Brandon Lee because everyone around him made the smallest possible adjustment to reality. Maybe he looked older because of stress. Maybe his accent sounded strange because of Canada. Maybe he knew too much because he was bright. Maybe he acted like an adult because grief had aged him. That is how the first lie survived. Not because it was perfect, because everyone helped make it make sense. Here is where the story becomes more uncomfortable. Because if Brandon Lee had walked into Bears Den Academy and failed at everything, the lie may have collapsed quickly. If he had been disruptive, teachers would have looked more closely. If he had struggled socially, classmates may have examined him harder. If he had seemed lost, someone may have started asking questions that paperwork did not answer. But Brandon did not fail. He excelled. He was clever. He worked hard. He studied with the intensity of someone who had more than grades on the line. To teachers, that made him a success story. To classmates, it made him unusual, but useful. He knew things. He could help. He could explain homework. He seemed to have a seriousness about him that was not common in a teenage boy, but in the context of school, seriousness can look like maturity. And maturity in a classroom is usually praised. This is where the second lie did its work. Lie 2, he was just mature for his age. That lie is softer than the first one. It does not require forged history. It only requires interpretation. You see a face that does not quite fit. You explain it. You hear an adult rhythm in a teenager's speech. You explain it. You see a boy driving, socializing, carrying knowledge that feels slightly too advanced. You explain it. The human mind does not like unfinished stories, so it files rough edges down until the picture is smooth enough to live with. And Brandon's rough edges had explanations attached to them. Canada, family loss, a complicated background, a bright mind, a difficult life. He did not have to fool everyone completely. He only had to place enough explanation in front of every doubt so that doubt had somewhere to sit. And while that was happening, he became woven into the school. He went to classes, he sat exams, he made friends. He was not standing outside the gates pretending from a distance. He was inside the ordinary rituals of adolescence. That is what makes this case more disturbing than a simple false document. It was not just a fake name on a form. It was a grown person moving through a teenage world and being accepted as part of it. And that teenage world had its own laws. Not legal laws, social laws. Who sits where? Who is strange? Who is safe? Who knows too much? Who gets teased? Who gets protected? Who is allowed inside the circle? Brandon stepped into that world with an advantage no real teenager had. He had already survived adolescence once. He had already learned how adults speak. He understood exams, ambition, status, and performance in a way his classmates could not possibly understand yet. To them, he was odd. To him, they were part of a root. That imbalance sits underneath the whole file. Because even if classmates liked him, even if some remembered him fondly, consent requires context. A teenager cannot properly choose how close to stand to someone when the most basic fact about that person has been removed. There were school performances, there were friendships, there were parties, there were ordinary conversations that would later be pulled apart and replayed by adults trying to understand what they had missed when they were children. He appeared in the school musical South Pacific. On paper, that detail almost sounds comic because the role and the lyrics seem to underline the absurdity of the whole deception. But when adults later revisited the footage, parts of it landed differently. A school performance is supposed to be a safe teenage memory. Once Brandon became Brian, even innocent-seeming moments acquired a second shadow. That is the strange cruelty of a case like this. It does not have to contain the worst crimes imaginable to still leave people disturbed. It is disturbing because it bends normal memories out of shape, and this is one of the cruel afterlives of deception. A lie does not only damage the moment when it is exposed, it reaches backward. It makes people re-watch their own memories. The joke they made, the car ride, the party, the scene in the school musical, the homework help, the private conversation, the time they stood next to him and thought, "He is strange, but he is one of us." After the truth comes out, every memory gets a second meaning. That is what a good imposter steals, not just trust, context. Now, if this were fiction, the writer would have to give Brandon a motive, a dark motive, a predatory motive, a criminal mastermind motive, something clean enough that the audience could point to it and say, "That is why." But reality is not always clean. Sometimes the motive is pathetic and alarming at the same time. Sometimes a person does something outrageous, not because they want a kingdom, but because they cannot let go of one closed door. For Brandon Lee, the door was medicine. The dream was to become a doctor, and this is where the story begins to split. The boy in the classroom wanted a future. The man behind the boy wanted to rewrite a past. Years earlier, before the name Brandon Lee appeared at Bears Den Academy, there had been another pupil at that school. His name was Brian MacKinnon. Brian had been bright. He had been ambitious. He had gone on to study medicine at the University of Glasgow. But the dream broke. Reports describe him leaving after failing exams, with illness forming part of his account of what happened. After that, the path back into medicine became harder and harder. Time passed. Rules changed around him. Doors that had once been open began to narrow. And for some people, failure becomes a wound. For others, it becomes a map. Brian MacKinnon looked at the life that had not worked and appears to have asked a question that most people would never allow themselves to ask. What if I could go back? Not emotionally, not symbolically, literally. What if I could return to the place where the path began, become a school pupil again, sit the exams again, apply again, and walk through the door with a younger name? Most people experience regret as a private haunting. They think about the exam they failed, the course they left, the opportunity they mishandled. They imagine what might have happened if they had been less sick, less frightened, less unlucky, less young, less themselves. But they do not usually build a body for that regret and send it back to school. Brian did. He did not simply say he wanted another chance. He constructed one. A new name, a new age, a new origin story, a new family arrangement, a new version of himself who could sit under fluorescent classroom lights and answer questions as if the previous 15 years had been redacted. That is the third lie. Lie 3. This was a new beginning. But it was not new. It was a replay. That is why the case feels so strange. It is not simply a man pretending to be younger. It is a man trying to occupy the same life twice. The same school, the same ambition, the same corridor of possibility. Only this time, he would change the details. He would change the name. He would change the age. He would change the story. And if the world accepted the paperwork, perhaps the world would have to accept the person. That is the emotional horror under the absurdity. A 30-year-old man did not sneak into a school because he wanted to pass a spelling test. He walked back into adolescence because adulthood had not given him the ending he wanted. The most dangerous part of a false identity is the moment it becomes useful to other people. At first, Brandon needed the school to accept him. Then the school began to benefit from him. He was doing well. He was getting strong results. He was a good student. A school does not usually interrogate excellence. It displays it. Reports from the time say Brian MacKinnon, under the name Brandon Lee, achieved 5 A grades in his higher grade examinations. He won a place to study medicine at the University of Dundee. The plan had worked. That is the part that feels impossible. Not that he tried, that he succeeded. He had taken the long way around the locked door and found a handle on the other side. And consider what that means psychologically. The lie was being rewarded. Every test result confirmed it. Every teacher's praise reinforced it. Every step closer to medicine made the deception feel not only successful, but perhaps even justified in his own mind. That is one of the ways a lie becomes dangerous. At first, it is an act, when it produces results. Then the person living inside it begins to treat those results as evidence that the lie deserves to exist. Brian's grades were real. His intelligence was real. His work may have been real. But the identity carrying all of it was not. And for a moment, it looked like the world had agreed to forget who he really was. But a lie that depends on age has one enemy it cannot defeat forever: documents. Not feelings, not rumors, not playground jokes. Documents. The truth was not in his face, although people had seen it. The truth was not in his voice, although people had heard it. The truth was not in the way he carried himself, although people had felt it. The truth was in the one thing his performance could not become: a real date of birth. And eventually, the story cracked open. In 1995, the name Brandon Lee began to collapse. Contemporary reports said classmates discovered the truth around a holiday after seeing information on a passport. The headmaster received an anonymous phone call. University and education authorities began asking questions, and then the fact arrived in public. Brandon Lee was not a teenager from Canada. He was Brian MacKinnon. He was Scottish. He had attended Bearsden Academy before. He had gone through those corridors years earlier as himself. When he returned under another name, he was around 30. By the time the story exploded in the media, he was 32. A man had re-entered his old school and lived among teenagers as one of them. The newspapers loved it because it had the shape of a headline that could not be improved. It was absurd in one sentence, it was disturbing in the next, and it had that rare quality tabloids understand immediately. A fact so strange that simply repeating it sounds like exaggeration. But inside Bearsden, it was not just a headline, it was a rupture. A school had to confront the fact that it had accepted a former pupil as a current one. Teachers had to live with the knowledge that some of them had been fooled by a man moving through the same institution twice. Former classmates had to ask whether their instincts had been warning them all along, or whether hindsight was rewriting everything. And suddenly, all the explanations changed shape. The mature face was not trauma. The strange confidence was not just intelligence. The adult way of speaking was not Canada. The knowledge was not a gifted boy being ahead of his years. It was exactly what some people had joked it might be, but no one had truly believed. He was not old for his age. He was old because he was old. Silence for 2 seconds. Then lower music bed returns. This is the reveal that makes the file feel fictional, because the mind resists it. A 30-year-old man cannot just walk into a school and become a pupil. A man cannot sit beside teenagers, take classes with them, socialize with them, perform in their school musical, earn grades, apply to medicine, and not be stopped. That is what the mind says. But this file exists because the mind is wrong. After the exposure, the consequences came quickly. Dundee University reviewed his position. Contemporary reporting from The Independent said university officials took the deception seriously because honesty and conduct mattered deeply in medicine. He had won his place while lying about who he was. That point matters. This was not only about age, it was about professional trust. Medicine is a field built on ethics, judgment, and disclosure. A person training to become a doctor is not just being tested on academic ability, they are being tested on whether they can be trusted with human vulnerability. A brilliant mark on an exam paper cannot cancel a false identity. A dream does not become harmless because the dreamer works hard. He apologized. He tried to explain. He said he had been desperate to become a doctor, but the university ultimately expelled him from the medical course. For Brian, that decision marked the apparent end of a dream he had been chasing for years. For the school, it was embarrassment. Enrollment procedures were tightened. The question hung in the air. How had this happened? For his classmates, the answer was more complicated. Because when a deception is public, people outside it want a simple reaction from the victims of the lie. They want outrage. They want humiliation. They want a clean villain and clean fools. But real memory is messier. Some classmates remembered Brandon with affection. Some remembered kindness. Some remembered discomfort. Some remembered the jokes. Some remembered moments that became unsettling only later. The 2022 documentary, My Old School, directed by Jono McLeod, one of the people who had known Brandon at school, Return to those memories with the people who lived them. Brian MacKinnon agreed to be interviewed, but he did not appear on camera. Actor Cumming lip-synced to his recorded interview. That choice says something about the whole case. Even decades later, the man at the center of the story was still present and absent at the same time. A voice without a face. A person behind a performance. A man still difficult to fully see. And then there is the part of the story that sits uneasily beneath the absurdity. A lot of people first hear this case and laugh. A 30-year-old schoolboy, a terrible wig, a fake Canadian backstory, a grown man sitting exams with teenagers. It sounds like a dark comedy because reality occasionally writes in tones fiction would be too embarrassed to use. But the longer you sit with it, the less funny the file becomes. Because this was a grown adult inside a child-centered environment. Because teenagers were asked, without knowing it, to participate in a stranger's second attempt at life. Because teachers were made into references for a false identity. Because ambition became more important than consent, honesty, and boundaries. And because every person around him was turned into a character in a script they did not know they were performing. So why did he do it? That is the question people always ask. It is also the question that keeps the case from becoming only a punchline. If all we see is the ridiculousness, we miss the human damage beneath it. If all we see is the sadness, we risk excusing the breach. The uncomfortable truth is that both can exist in the same person. And the answer depends on how generous you feel when you open the file. One version says he was desperate. Another says he was delusional. Another says he was arrogant enough to believe rules were for people with smaller dreams. Another says he was a damaged person trapped inside a past he could not stop trying to correct. None of those explanations cancel the others. Human beings are rarely one thing. A person can be desperate and deceptive, wounded and manipulative, brilliant and dishonest, sympathetic from one angle and alarming from another. That is why this file belongs inside false fiction. Because if you wrote Brian MacKinnon as pure villain, the story would be too simple. If you wrote him as pure victim, it would be too forgiving. The truth sits in the more uncomfortable place between them. What happened at Bears Den Academy was not just a prank. It was not just a man lying about his age. It was a collision between ambition and identity. A man wanted a future so badly that he returned to the place where his first future began. He did not simply dream of being young again. He submitted paperwork for it. He attended classes for it. He built friendships through it. He sat exams under it. He applied to medicine with it. And for a while, the world let him have it. So let us put the 3 lies back on the board. Lie 1. His name was Brandon Lee. It was not. His name was Brian MacKinnon. Lie 2. He was just mature for his age. He was not mature for his age. He was an adult. Lie 3. This was a new beginning. It was not. It was an attempted rewind. And that is the real twist. The story was never about a teenager trying to become a doctor. It was about a man trying to become the teenager who still could. There are stories where the lie is designed to steal money. Stories where the lie is designed to hide violence. Stories where the lie is designed to trap someone else inside a false reality. This one is stranger. Because Brian MacKinnon's lie seems to have been designed, at least in part, to trap himself. Inside a younger body. Inside a better chance. Inside a school corridor where the future had not yet rejected him. But time is not a form you can falsify forever. Eventually, the date of birth appears. Eventually, the file opens. Eventually, the boy in the classroom becomes the man in the headline. And everyone who thought they knew Brandon Lee is left with the same impossible question. How long can a person pretend to be someone else before the pretend version becomes the only version anyone remembers? This was false fiction. The story began as a schoolboy's second chance. That was the first lie. The truth was older. If this file stayed with you, subscribe to False Fiction. Every episode begins like fiction. The problem is, it happened. False fiction, unscripted truth with no rules.